Well, welcome to the Shepherd Heart Leader podcast, where we explore topics that help strengthen your ability to care for those under your leadership. Now, churches are filled with people who have suffered trauma and abuse, and a lot of times we don't even recognize it or see it. The church needs to be a safe place where people can come and experience Jesus. Now, today, our guests, Darlene Cook and David Nithang, have been actively involved in this work through Door of Hope Ministries. And last episode, we had a chance to listen to the executive director of Door of Hope, and we're going to dive into what is abuse and go a little bit deeper on this episode. So, Darlene and David, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you guys here. Now, first of all, you two are not new to Emmanuel, so let's start with Darlene. Maybe give a quick background on how you know Emmanuel.
Well, right out of high school, I came and started working for Pastor Mark Denius, and I worked with him for a few years, and then was gone for quite a while and came back in 2000 and was working in the office as well for a couple of the pastors, and was here until 2019 when I made the transition to Door of Hope.
I remember that when that happened. And David?
Yeah, I walked through the door of Emmanuel 1998 as a college student at Northwestern. And it was a Wednesday night. It was youth ministry, and I was hooked and never left. Matter of fact, Pastor Nate and Jodi, you guys were the youth pastors then, and you haven't got rid of me yet. So glad to be here.
Yeah, and you've been on staff at Emmanuel as well. Maybe give the listeners just a little bit of what you did.
Yes, a total of almost 20 years here at Emmanuel. The first 14 years in kids ministry for almost 10 years, and then did every other pastoral ministry role outside of being the senior pastor the next 4 years, and then transitioned to another church for 4 years where I was a groups pastor and campus pastor, but then came back for over the last 3 years, kids director, and now consulting in kids ministry here. So it's been an honor.
We're so glad to have you here and a part of the church. Now, you two have both been involved in Door of Hope Ministries. Maybe explain how you got started. Well, Darlene, how did you get involved in this kind of work?
Well, when I was working at Emmanuel, I worked with Recovery Ministries and with support groups. And at one point back in 2012, my heart was just really pulled and filled with passion for people who've experienced abuse and wanting to help them in their healing journey. So I started leading a support group here at Emmanuel for people who had experienced abuse. And a few years later, in 2015, I met Diane Storrs, who you guys all met last week, and learned that she had curriculum for support groups, and she got my interest. So we started interacting. I had her come and teach the support group curriculum to my group here at the church. But then Emmanuel put on a pause on Recovery Ministry. So at that point, we were ready at Door of Hope to move that group to the Door of Hope facility and just continued using their curriculum. And so that's how I got started as a volunteer while I was still working full-time here at Emmanuel. But over a period of time between 2016 and 19, I got more and more involved, and in 2019 made the decision to work full-time at Door of Hope.
Wow, amazing. David?
Yeah, I first heard about Door of Hope because Darlene, who I call Darla, she was my administrative assistant, and she told me she was transitioning out of that role to go work at Door of Hope. That's when I first heard about it. But 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, I personally found myself at the doorsteps of Door of Hope and was walking through a very painful season of life, went through separation and a divorce. And I have been, for the last 4 years, a recipient of the care and the ministry of Door of Hope. And so it's an honor to be able to give back on what I've learned and what I've healed from. There's a saying that you can't give what you don't have. Mm-hmm. And because I've got to embrace and experience healing, I'm committed for the rest of my life to offer the healing that comes from the ministry of Door of Hope to as many people that are interested. So
it's amazing. Now, in the last episode, Diane discussed some of the need. She shared her personal story and like how the ministries began. On this episode, I want to dive into what is abuse. And I had gone to your guys' conference, and that, particular workshop, really impacted me because we have general ideas of what abuse is, but we don't always see all the facets of abuse and abuse in others, how we're abused, and maybe even how we can be abusive. And so let's first of all talk about what is abuse.
It's basically a pattern of behavior where one person is exerting power or control over another. And that can take on many forms, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it can even start in childhood, where a parent is abusing a child, or a different adult or a neighbor or another kid abuses a child. And so many people experience abuse at that level. And, some of that is still rooted in power and control. But just this week in our groups, we were talking about this topic and how some people who might be abusive as a parent towards a child or a step-parent or other adults, it could just be lack of parenting skills. They maybe had abuse themselves, unhealed trauma themselves, which we're going to be talking about. And out of our own wounds and our own hurts that we've had where we never learned a healthy way to relate to other people, we might become abusive to our children or other family members. A lot of the people that come to Door of Hope have experienced childhood abuse, which then led to them experience abuse at a later age. And it just kind of continues until you find a way to resolve that trauma that you experience. Some people get help through counseling right away, but some people never tell anybody that they were abused. And so they don't get the help that they needed. They don't have the resources they need to actually process the trauma. And so there can be a lot of different reasons why a person's abusive, but mostly in the long run that we say is that it's power and control over another individual and their behaviors towards that person.
Wow. So when you think about power and control, any of us can really be abusive. Like you said, if we've been abused, we may not even be aware if we're being power and control over people. I was telling you guys before we started recording, I'll wrap myself out and tell the story, but after going to the conference and realizing, I can come home and if Nate's like buying shoes or something, I can find myself getting mad and going, wait, that's controlling because I'm okay with myself buying stuff, but I might have more of an opinion about him. And I'm like, if I'm exerting control over another person, I mean, there's other things when it comes to budgets and agreeing on things, but being able to go, hey, I've got to stop some of that behavior or all of it and go, we got to build some trust. So yeah.
Yeah, when you hear the word abuse and when you hear it's about power and control, it sounds very offensive or aggressive. But when you really think about it, it's when we're at a very vulnerable place in our inner world where we have lost control or we don't have control and we desire it. So it really comes from a place of weakness and vulnerability. So then we try to gain that through power and controlling. So, yeah.
So there are like 5 or 6 different kinds of abuse that you cover at Door of Hope and in your workshops. Can you just explain some of those and let's walk through it? What kind of abuses are there?
We'll do just high level, the 6 different types of abuse. One is called emotional abuse, and this really includes like hurting others' feelings by name calling, degrading, making unfair comments, cursing, swearing, tone of voice, screaming, yelling. It could also include withholding, silent treatment, stonewalling, blocking out someone while they're trying to connect with you. It could be blaming someone, saying it's all your fault, everything happened because of you. It could even look like trying to control the checkbook in a relationship.
Oh, so I gotta watch those shoes, Benny.
The shoes. Back to the shoes.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh man.
I'm trying to be nice.
As a sneakerhead, I'm happy for Nate that you were aware of what was happening. Good for Nate. Another form of abuse is psychological abuse, and psychological abuse is any type of threat to do bodily harm. It's not physical, but it's threat to harm you, a family member. It could even be a pet. It could even be harming themselves to gain power and control, threatening to punch, hit, slap, kick, use a weapon. So threats to do actual harm to you, but not actually doing it. So that would be psychological abuse.
And I think a lot of times that threat to, like, if you leave me, if somebody gets to that point where they're like, I don't want to be in this abusive situation anymore, and they're talking about leaving. Well, if you leave, I'm just going to kill myself. And they use that as a means to scare the person into not leaving, because they feel like, oh, I couldn't live with myself if they took their life. So that some of these threats are very powerful. Or if you leave, I'm going to hurt your family. I'm going to kill the dog. Or just it's very, very big source of that power and control.
And not even just the threatening. It could be throwing something not totally at you, but in your direction to intimidate you. Breaking things, punching walls.
Like maybe give an example of that when you're saying throw something kind of on the side to your attention.
Yeah. Do you want to dive into that? Yeah.
Well, if somebody threw something right at you, that would transition more into physical abuse. But sometimes people, they're not quite ready to hurt you physically because they know they'll get in big trouble. But they might take something that could really harm you and just throw it really close to you.
Okay.
And that's scary.
Yep.
Because you feel like, oh, did they just miss? What, did they miss on purpose? Next time, are they going to hit me? And so it's to bring that fear and intimidation for that purpose of power and control. And so these are those kind of high-level situations where a relationship is really getting out of control, where the person feels controlled. And so many times people go for help, but he never hurt me. Or she, this could be male or female, because that's a question a lot of times people in leadership will ask, well, was there any physical abuse? And you actually, in this case that he just described, there has been no touching, no physical harm yet.
So if you called 911, they would do nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
No
It's
bruising,
just the threat is there. And so it's not looked at as seriously, but the emotional toll that both emotional abuse and the psychological abuse take on a person is very strong. The stress level, the cortisol that's flowing through their body, it's constant, all the negative chemicals. And so many people, even if it's at this level, or I'm also going to mention gaslighting and spiritual abuse, even though there's no physical or sexual abuse, your body is suffering because of the stress that you're under. And a lot of people end up with autoimmune issues, really chronic health issues that are serious. People can even have heart attacks or strokes because of the stress. And so my kind of bandwagon that I'm on with that, or my soapbox, is that if someone has experienced emotional abuse or psychological abuse or some of these other ones that aren't physical, that we still take it seriously and look at that individual like, we need to do something to help this person.
Wow. So then there's a few more. Keep going on.
Okay. Yeah. So and the obvious ones also then are the physical abuse. Anytime there's non-accidental use of force against somebody, the hitting, the slapping, choking is probably another really common one. And, those we say call 911 and don't keep enduring it. But so many people, we find too, they might call 911, the police come, but yet then they choose, I'm not going to press charges. I don't want them to get in trouble. And so there's, because of the emotional abuse and the psychological abuse, they still feel like, it must be my fault that he did this. And because they've been constantly blamed for the other person's behavior. And so many times charges aren't pressed, or the person might go to jail overnight, and then next day they're back home. And so it's really sad that people who have experienced this type of abuse for so long, or, over a period of time, there's that emotional attachment still there. And that's hard for a lot of people to understand. Like, okay, he beat you up, why are you letting him back home? And then there's sexual abuse. And a lot of times we hear about sexual abuse that happens to children. And the statistics on that are just horrible. It's like these are reported numbers, and so many people don't report. But 1 out of 3 girls and 1 out of 5 boys have been sexually abused. And then this goes on to affect them later in life. So that's just very painful. But then, as teenagers, and when, people start dating and having romantic relationships, teenagers, young adults, there's a lot of date rape, and almost everybody that you would talk to in a high school or college say, yeah, I know somebody that this happened to, or it happened to me. It's way more common than we know. But then even sexual abuse later in life as adults, or even in a marriage, or a consensual relationship, anytime you're forced to do something that you don't want to do, you can't say no. Your no is not respected. We look at that as also sexual abuse, when you're forced to do something that you're not comfortable to do, and there's a lot of pressure. And so that might be one that a lot of people don't recognize, because that can happen in marriage.
Yeah. I would bet a lot of people don't even think about that.
Yeah. And then there's the gaslighting abuse. And I had never heard of gaslighting before I went to Door of Hope. I think it's getting to be more of a common term now.
It's a buzzword.
I think it's some in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
You have to Google what gaslighting is, and now everyone knows.
But it's basically, again, the stories that I've heard where there's been gaslighting, it's usually been where the spouse or the partner is maybe in a position where they don't want to get in trouble. So it could be a church leader, it could be like the head of a company, CEO, and they want to maintain a good reputation. So and it's like, to me, it's hard to understand how somebody calculates this out, but it happens. So the type of abuse we see in those situations is very subtle. It's also nicknamed crazy making. So everything you say and you think, or you reflect back, like, did you say we were going to go to the park this weekend? Oh, I never said that. You're imagining that. Or anytime you repeat back something that you were told by the other person, they deny it. And so they say, you must be going crazy. What's wrong with your memory? And they keep putting doubt in your mind, like, am I cracking up? Am I going crazy? And you start to doubt your own worth, your own value, and your ability to think. And you start to believe that. And you also start to believe, well, everything that's going wrong is my fault, because that's what I'm being told. And I'm kind of a mess. I'm going crazy. And so the person just loses their value. It's very confusing, very confusing. And it's a very sad type of abuse to see. And again, that takes that toll on an individual physically. So they can end up with a lot of health issues. And that's always, as leaders, we can watch for that, not just say, ask about the abuse or that situation, but how are you doing physically? How is this affecting you? And to recognize those pieces too. The last kind of abuse, actually, we do have one more now that we're starting to talk about, but the last one for the
let's add it in.
Okay, but I'm going to talk about spiritual abuse, and spiritual abuse can happen in various levels. It can be a parent with a child, or an adult authority figure with a child. So like asking the child to do something that's inappropriate, but like you have to, the Bible says honor your parents or respect your elders. And so whatever I'm asking you to do, even if it doesn't feel right to you, you need to do it because I'm asking you to do it. It's using spiritual authority or Bible verses out of context to get someone to do something you don't want to do. It's also used in marriages quite a bit where, again, saying, well, this is what God says, this is what the Bible says, and so you need to do this for me, and, exerting authority in an inappropriate way, using the scriptures out of context. And we see this a lot happening as well, especially with the gaslighting situations. There's kind of a mix of the two that we see there, and it can happen also outside of a family relationship. And I think, David, you were going to touch on that.
Spiritual abuse can come from your spiritual leaders from church, pastors, ministry leaders, and that's really a hot topic for young people that are becoming more aware of why they made decisions or how they made decisions, and faith in Jesus wasn't liberating. It was more debilitating and behaving correctly, which comes from maybe church leaders identifying, here's what spirituality looks like, and if you aren't, you're less than, And so as a pastor for over 2 decades, if you really slow down and think about it, people have given us a platform and a high level influence in our life. And we have to be hypersensitive to our motives when we're casting vision, but not just when we're casting vision, but when we might get in the way, or we might be forcing something more than that God might be wanting or forcing. And it could be really good things too.
Yeah.
Very spiritual things. That's where it gets really, really tricky, because your intentions could be good for the body of Christ, for that person, for your congregation. And you could miss it. Like, wow, I really am trying to be controlling, and I'm using my influence that people have given me in an unhealthy way. And so,
Yeah, I think that's a really good filter is, am I being controlling, or are these people still having a free will? Are we trying to trump the free will and saying, this is what God says, this is what you have to do? Yeah, that's amazing, powerful filter, I think.
We say this a lot at Door of Hope as we're walking through support groups or in prayer ministries, that you always have a choice. So many people have taken away your choices with that power and control. But God's nature is He gives us a choice. He gives us that free will, like you just mentioned.
Yep.
And so that's where we can check ourselves. Am I giving this person a choice, or am I telling them what to do without a choice to go one way or the other?
And you said there was another one you added to the list.
So we revised our book this year at the beginning of January, and we added cyber and digital abuse.
Oh, okay.
And so this would be abuse that might happen over social media, where someone is doing things that are inappropriate, to each other. And, this can happen in young people, older. And so people can get abusive online. But then there's also people who are really good with technology. So let's just say there's a relationship where there's a separation, the spouse is left, and the person is losing their power and control. But I can hack into their phone. I can hack into their computer. I can read their emails and know what they're still know what they're doing and try to have some control.
360, find their location, all those things.
It is really scary. And I know several women who said, yes, that was me. That happened to me. And it's very violating, scary. They usually when it first happens, they're just in tears. It just feels scary, violating.
Another level of feeling trapped, right?
Yeah. So anyway, that's the new one we added.
Wow. So there's abuse, and then there's domestic abuse. And so you said some of this abuse is happening in homes and through individuals. Explain what you've seen the most of.
I think for the people who come to Door of Hope, most of them have experienced childhood abuse in the home. Some of the childhood abuse might have been from just somebody the family knew, or some of it might have been a stranger, but the majority of it was abuse that happened in the home. And when we really dig into it, they'll say, but I know my mom or my dad, whoever was the abusive person, that they were also abused. Or they were an alcoholic, and so they were always out of control and not really all there, and so they were abusive because of that. Sometimes it's a step-parent, and I'm not, most step-parents are really good, but if an unhealthy person then marries another unhealthy person, like the step-parent, and sometimes there's a lot of abuse and inappropriate activity in those situations, and so a child grows up with that unhealed trauma, and as they go into their adult relationships, if there's that unprocessed trauma, they are probably going to make bad choices as far as who they're going to be in relationship with, who they get involved with. They just never learn to see those red flags. This all feels normal. I was always told as a child, I got in trouble and it was my fault, and the reason this happened to me, it was my fault. So as an adult, everything that goes wrong, if I'm being mistreated, it must be my fault. That you just start to believe lies about yourself, lies about your situation, and they just never had the help or the resources they needed to resolve that. And so the abuse cycle just keeps going over and over and over again in their lives until they get the help they need. And that's part of our passion, is to provide those resources and the help.
Now, what I've seen for men's, as I lead men's support groups, I really was shocked at the 1 out of every 5 men have experienced sexual abuse. And I I've led 8 men's support groups as being the men's director for the last year. And that statistic has proven to be true as these guys open up. And it blew me away. So that statistic is real. And those are the ones just reported. 1 out of every 5 boys. What I've also seen, most of it is childhood, things that stem from childhood that's unresolved. And the second one would be in their current long-term relationship with the spouse, marital things that's arising and stirring up, and they're recognizing that maybe they have been an abuser or they've been a recipient of an abusive spouse. And I also, we didn't go into trauma A, trauma B, but trauma B, the bad stuff that you weren't supposed to receive, and trauma A, the absence of the good stuff you were supposed to get. And I would say in our men's group, what we're seeing, I would say 80% of it is them recognizing, wow, I missed out and I didn't get the parts and the love. I was neglected and experienced the absence of the love and support that I was supposed to get from my parents, but they didn't have the capacity to give that to me because they never received it themselves. And so I would say that's probably the majority of what we're seeing our men work through.
Wow.
And the women too. Trauma A is very common. The absence of feeling cherished and delighted, and someone that helps you learn how to do the hard things. So if you never really learn to have that persistence and to press through on some of the hard things we need to do in life, you tend to give up a lot.
And would you say a lot of it was a whole generation, like the way the boomers maybe raised their kids is different, now our generation raises our kids different, and their kids are being raised different. I mean, is it a generational thing where we're like, whoa, there's a whole generation that experienced abuse? Or
it seems that trauma A can be really generational, so how they were raised, that's all they know.
Yeah.
And so it's not like they're being malicious or abusive, by withholding that. It's just that that's all they maybe ever received and what feels normal and natural to them. And so, each generation that walks through this, hopefully we're learning more and learning how to give our children what they need. But we still do see a lot of people, even younger people.
So are there any telltale signs that you look at someone and go, oh yeah, they got trauma and abuse in their life? Maybe they don't even know it or haven't recognized it, but there's some symptoms that seem to float to the surface.
I would love to
those
respond, because when I first experienced Door of Hope and signed up for a prayer counseling, and I was just trauma informed, and I was just thirsty for more understanding, because it was just enlightening my mind, but also healing my soul. And I asked Diane, who was leading the prayer appointment, I said, how do you know if you have unresolved, unprocessed, unhealed trauma within or someone else? And she said this, I'll never forget it. When someone has the inability to receive good things. And I was blown away at the thought of, wait, someone that might be able to give compliments can't receive compliments, can serve someone but can't have someone help them, right? Like when you have the inability to receive, or it could be feedback. Like I can give hard feedback, but don't give me hard feedback, because I have the inability to receive that. Staying regulated, right? Open-hearted, knowing this person might mean well, or even if they're being aggressive about it, I should probably pay attention, because there might be some percentage of truth to what they're telling me, because I hurt them. I hurt them, and they're responding in a way that's communicating, you hurt me. You hurt me. And so inability to receive.
And there's a lot of different symptoms as well. Like with trauma A, people tend to try to fill that void of not feeling like they belong, not feeling accepted or approval. So a lot of people try to fill that void with addictive behaviors. So they might go to, if they drink alcohol or take drugs or sexual addictions, it kind of fills that niche in their gut, like, oh, okay, that took the pain away of not feeling like I belong. And so if you see those addictive behaviors, for me, it was approval addiction, always trying to earn approval, and so rejection was a big trigger for me. If I felt like somebody was giving me that feedback or whatever, I would automatically go to reaction on rejection. With the trauma B, which would be the bad things, that all the different kinds of abuse we just described, a lot of times if there's unhealed trauma, then we still have triggers, buried trauma in our brain. And if something happens today that reminds my memory, my brain, of something that happened to me at an earlier time that was really traumatic, and that part of my brain isn't healed yet, that experience isn't healed yet, I will react as if I was in the original experience, not according to what's happening right now, but more the original experience. So we have these explosive responses that don't seem like they fit the current situation, like the big overreactions, too much anger, too much fear, too much overreacting, even with too much sadness, just everything feels so big. So seeing people who have these big responses of fight, flight, freeze, those can be signs that somebody still has a lot of unprocessed trauma. If somebody gets help and those areas are healed, they're probably living fairly successfully and, with a lot of peace in their life. But as long as that unresolved trauma is there, it's hard to live a life of happiness and, and peace and contentment. And, there's the scripture in the Bible that says, leave the past behind. But actually Paul was talking about, all his achievements, and I'm not going to, I'm setting aside all my achievements and all the good things I did, and moving forward. So he wasn't even talking about past pain. He was talking about past achievements. But so many times I think, in the church, we use that scripture to say, oh, forget all that stuff and just move forward. But as long as the past is still getting triggered and that trauma is not resolved, that person needs some help. They need some healing, and we're here, obviously, to help with that.
So what does the process look like for helping someone get healed?
So, at Door of Hope, we offer support groups and trauma recovery prayer counseling, and also we have licensed therapists. But in a church setting, or as a church leader, I'm thinking that might be the direction you're coming from. Somebody comes to you and they start to tell you their story and say, I'm really struggling, this is going on. The first thing to do is be a good listener. And, listen without judgment, attune to them. Attuning is, I see you, I hear you, and I care. I think so many times we'll hear something and we'll start kind of getting judgmental and asking questions like, well, what did you do to make him do that? Or, that would be a really horrible question. But
people probably ask it, or at least they think it.
I just had somebody this week say that people always said that to her. What did you do? Well, what did you do to cause that? And, that's not helpful. So just attune and listen. I think a lot of times people don't feel like people believe them. So actually say it out loud. I believe you. I believe you. And how can I help? So instead of you all of a sudden throwing out a boatload of advice, listen, I believe you. How can I help? So, and not go into a fix-it mode, because sometimes we're going to say things in a fix-it mode that are not helpful. But be aware of resources. If you feel like this person needs help that isn't available within your own ministry, refer them to places like Door of Hope. Or if they need shelter, like, to go to Alexander House or the dwelling place, to get to a safe place, for those really extreme situations. And again, you might not feel real comfortable in advising that. And at Door of Hope, if someone comes to us and they're in an unsafe situation, most people, that's when like the murder-suicides happen, and and the really dangerous situations is when someone's trying to leave. So we go through a safety plan. How do you leave safely without being harmed, hopefully? There's never any guarantees, but we can walk people through that. So it's knowing that, or having someone on your staff get trained in how to communicate a safety plan.
Yeah, Jodi, I would say...
Go ahead.
Is learning how to create safety, emotional safety. No one's going to take your advice if they don't feel emotionally safe with you. And so how do we create an environment, an atmosphere where they will do this first thing, confess? And a lot of times we hear the word confess in church, and we think confess sins. No. Can I create emotional safety where you feel safe to confess that life is just really hard and painful, and I'm willing to listen and lean in without judgment, and that's not easy to do. But when you can create a level of safety, that person then has the ability to really confess, like, I'm going through something that's too hard. Because most people that are abusive, if you might ask them, they don't like what they're doing, but they don't know how to stop what they're doing. And they're too ashamed to confess, I have problems and issues. And so what I've learned is when we can be good at creating emotional safety where people can take their armor off, their mask off, and just really open up of where am I really at, then they're open to have psychological safety, which means like, hey, do you want to listen to some tools? Do you want to go to a support group? Do you want to go to this workshop? Do you want to hear more about Door of Hope and the modalities that we have here to help? But if we don't create emotional safety first, people just don't feel known, valued, and cared for, and they'll just walk away from you and stay stuck.
So let's talk. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the support group.
Yeah.
What about the support group that is helpful? Is it the curriculum that you're covering? Is it the relationships that are formed, the confidentiality? What is it that is helpful about the support groups?
One thing for our men, and I have a little different, we do the same modality, but I have a little different approach for the men, is when we first get there, we have a check-in. Hey, how are you doing? And a word we like to use is attune. Attuning to yourself and learning how to attune to other people. And also, how do we attune to our Heavenly Father, God? And so having an initial check-in is really important. Like, when's the last time you asked yourself, how am I doing? And really took the time to really go, am I okay? Am I not okay? What am I carrying? Giving yourself permission to have emotions, to have feelings, to have needs. I'll tell you that as men, we're not good at that. Because what generally speaking, boys are taught, you're not supposed to have emotion. You're not supposed to express emotion because that's not what boys do. And a lot of times they've been told that's what girls do. So it's gender shaming, right? And then if they've shared some level of emotion or frustration, it's just shut up and fix it. Figure it out. Man up. Don't be, you fill in the blank. And so what guys do is they shut down. I think two things really happen when for guys. They either become overly masculine, overly alpha, and dominant, or they become extremely passive and apathetic. And those are the two major effects of abuse that men experience, and they just get stuck and don't know what to do with that. So the check-in and attuning to self, attuning how to attune to God, and knowing that after I've shared, I can attune to other people. And so we see people move from getting stuck to unstuck when they can do that. So
the way we do support groups is a little different than a typical Bible study as well. Like, we limit the groups to 10 people. That'd include the leaders usually. So we keep it small enough so it feels safe. And the first night, we don't do a lesson. We just all go around and tell stories. We say only share what you're comfortable sharing, but they all tell everything, you know. We say try to do a 5-minute version. Sometimes we'll go to 10 minutes. But sometimes in that first night, they feel like, okay, I'm in a safe place, and I can tell my story for the first time. I have never told anybody this story. That happens in both the men's groups and the women's groups.
Yes.
And they feel like, I'm not the only one. Other people have experienced this too. And even though the stories are different, so it's that community of safety. So that first night is really important. So then we usually say nobody can join after the first night because we built that community. And but then we do have curriculum. Each week there's another lesson that we are learning about abuse, how to overcome lies and, find truth, understanding how trauma affects the brain, just so many different areas that we cover in the curriculum. But we have a lot of time. We're more facilitating, though. We say, read the lesson ahead, and we're going to talk about it in group. And so you just have a chance to interact and talk and share your own experiences throughout the 9 weeks. But it's just a 9-week group. It's not like doesn't go on and on. Sometimes people will decide to do it more than once because the first time it was, if it's new to them, so much information, like I need to do this again so I can really absorb this and start to process it more. And then we have other support groups if they want to, after they do Authentic Hope or Getting Real for the guys, we have other groups where they can go deeper and keep learning, things like on boundaries, learning how to have stronger relationships with God and with people, healthier. So we keep giving them more and more tools if they want to keep growing.
Yeah, we don't accidentally become who we are. And I would say when a guy signs up for the first time and experiences our Getting Real support group, it's really 80% about the community, like a safe place. I hear by week 2 of every 9-week session, you'll hear guys go, I can't believe I'm sharing this. I've never told anyone this. I've had a best friend for 25 years and I've never told them this pain that I've experienced at some point in my life. And they're isolated. They're carrying these things on by themselves. And so I would say when session 1, it's like 80% the community, 20% the content. And when they come back, now they feel emotionally safe. Now they can ingest and digest the tools and the resources that we have here, psychologically received and start using it. And you see people really accelerate their healing process.
So when you go into any room, like at the church, a congregation, how many of those people in the congregation do you think are abused or like still living with the effects of abuse?
I would say at least 30%. Could be 40 or 50%. So many people, in our first lesson, we talk about coping mechanisms. And one of them is, I have a smile on my face, but I'm crying on the inside. And I think about, Fridley Assembly of God, which it became Emmanuel. And Pastor Dennis used to say, we want to reach those who are hurting and crying behind closed doors. And that is so true, that people are really get good at putting on a mask, pretending they're okay. And so we just don't know the pain that they're in. So I would say between 30 and 50% in any given church, if not more.
Wow. I know you guys have said before where you've talked to church leaders and they're like, oh, we don't have anybody in our church that has suffered abuse because they're thinking about the big things and not even realizing how much people are hiding. I think in our social media era where everyone's used to putting on their Instagram filters and everything's got to look good, people have become less authentic with each other. I've been involved in other conferences and stuff where it's like, okay, let's confess, let's talk about what's really going on, and hearing a lot of people say that I've never told anyone this ever in my life. And so really going, let's, get authentic and real with each other in the body of Christ where people can begin to heal. So as we're wrapping up today, is there any other things that would be helpful for Shepherd Heart leaders to know how to minister to people in the church that are dealing with trauma and abuse?
Yeah. Well, as we were talking about our support groups, when I learned how important community is, I thought about, because both David and I have worked here at Emmanuel in the Connect Group department and, trying to encourage people to be in community. And I thought, that's what we need. And we do encourage people that come to Door of Hope, you need to be in community in your church as well. And I just want to say those Connect groups are super important as well, even though they're not talking about trauma and directly, but if people can come to a Connect group and be authentic, find a safe place. I'm not saying every Connect group is that style, but as Connect group leaders or other ministry leaders where you meet in small groups, people need community in order to heal. And so provide that safe place for them in the Connect groups. And that's the long-term relationships. Our support groups are only 9 weeks long. And so they need the long-term help too.
I would say a couple things. Ask people if they would be able to have you listen to their story before you cast any judgment. preconceived ideas based upon their behavior that you might not like. Would you tell me their story and listen well? Listen with no agenda. And then in return, what Darlene said is authentically share your story and your parts that they'll relate with. And what you see happen is biblical community happens, where the masks come on. And what I like to share for the guys, the armor comes off.
Yeah.
The pads, the masculine bravado that men feel like they have to carry, they come off, and then they can breathe and feel lighter. And when that happens, I think a beautiful thing happens. People begin to heal.
As we train up new leaders, we say one of the most important things is that you yourself need to be vulnerable and tell your story, and keep weaving that in every week. And as you as you're vulnerable, others will be as well. You model that.
And how do people tell their story without feeling like they're a victim? And maybe that's the wrong question to ask. I don't know.
Well, the reality is they were a victim at one point. You know, we don't like to use labels, but you can share your story and, as what happened, where you're at right now. And, if you're further along in your healing journey, if some of that trauma is healed, you share that part of the story as also. But I think it's good for people to know that you've experienced something really hard. And it's just kind of how you share it and your heart behind it, I think.
And when you share your story, how do you make it so it stays about your story and not about the person who did the damage?
Oh, that's kind of tricky. And I mean, obviously, if there was power and control and abuse, the other person did things that were inappropriate, but it doesn't have to be a big blame game. And so you share your story, and a lot of times people will almost want to defend the person who abused them. Well, they were abused by their parents, and, they grew up even worse situation than I did, or, and so a lot of times they will excuse their behavior or try to defend it as well. So I don't see too much of them, putting the other person down. When a person is in a current situation, like say they're in a marriage that's very unhealthy and abusive, it's probably a little trickier in that situation because you're trying to state what's happening and defend yourself. And one thing I didn't mention about the gaslighting is if a person is choosing, and I think, and again, I can hardly wrap my head around that, but to use that type of abuse, the other thing we see happening then is that person will also go around to all their friends, their family members, maybe other church leaders, say, I don't know what's wrong with my spouse. If it's the husband with the wife, just say, she's just really acting crazy. She's accusing me of so many things I'm not doing. She doesn't remember things correctly, and just kind of set the stage so that if the wife at some point should go for help, everybody already has a preconceived idea that she's going crazy and that she doesn't believe things accurately. And that happens a lot, and it just makes me really sad. So as church leaders, just pray for discernment if that's happening, or friends, family, if somebody's saying that, and just be sure that when the person who's being abused comes to you, that you listen and try to catch both sides of the story. Don't go in with the judgment already made.
Can I respond to the victim mentality person that you might address? What I've seen work really well is affirming that person for sharing. Hey, thanks for sharing that. Really sorry that happened. And I mentioned emotional safety. If that person is someone that is consistent in your life, the more you do that, what happens is they begin to trust and they begin to soften. And what we like to say at Door of Hope is their joy capacity builds up. And the way we define joy is that someone's happy to be with me, even in the midst of my ugliest moments, even in the midst of having this victim mentality. They're consistently with me, and they're not moved, or they don't react in a negative way of me just sitting in my cesspool of pain. And what happens is their hearts soften, and then they're way more open to go, wait a minute, I'm ready for some help. Wait a minute, do you have something to offer me? And it can be hard as a leader to wait for that right moment, because we want to fix people right now with the best of intentions. But that's abusive, because that's controlling, right?
Yeah, let them do it at their own speed and time.
Or at the speed of, we talking about the speed of relationship, right? The speed of the Holy Spirit really ministering to some people, waiting for that Holy Spirit to say, now is the time, right? They're ready to receive, because they have the inability to receive, because right now they just have that victim mentality right now. So they're not ready. So it's abusive to push something on them then. So.
Wow, this is so.
It's a whole nother podcast, right?
This is such a great conversation. Thank you so much for everything that you shared and being so vulnerable. And we'll continue the conversation on how we can help people heal of trauma and abuse.
Thanks, Jodi.
So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Shepherd Heart Leader podcast. Wow, what a great episode. I hope you were blessed by this conversation. We would love to hear from you. Appreciate any comments, and please like and subscribe and share this episode with friends. Is there somebody maybe that you know that could use a little bit of encouragement? All of us can get better at helping those in our lives who are suffering from trauma and abuse, and also checking our heart to make sure we're not being controlling or abusive. We appreciate you, and until next time, keep leading well.